All right. If everybody could take the... Can you hear me? All right. If I can have your attention, please. Thank you. All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 12th edition of the annual World Wetlands Day Research Symposium here at University of Waterloo. So my name is Philippe Van Kappelen. I'm a professor at University of Waterloo, where I lead the ecohydrology research group. Our research centers on water resources in general and water quality in particular. Just so that you know, there will be a question and answer period, a Q&A period, at the end or after the distinguished lecture. So please hold on to your questions until then. I also need to mention that, as you can see, the event is being filmed and broadcast online, so we have quite a few people following us online. And the recording will also be available after the event, so you'll be able to go to the website and find the recording. So I'd like to start, I'll get my papers right here, with the land acknowledgement. So we are gathered here on the main campus of the University of Waterloo, which is located on the Haldeman Tract, the land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and is located on the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. So our ability to live and work here in the Waterloo region, in Ontario and in Canada, is a direct outcome of policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation, and since then. The harms of these policies are many, are still being felt by Indigenous communities today. So we therefore collectively have a responsibility to acknowledge and understand this history and the current experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. And this understanding should also inform the work that we do, so that first we can stop perpetuating the damages of colonization, and second, to begin to repair them, and land acknowledgement are just one little step in this direction. And particularly on this World Wetlands Day, I would like you to kind of recognize the key role that Indigenous people play in understanding, nurturing, and protecting our shared wetlands. So World Wetlands Day is an international day that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly to celebrate and heighten awareness of the critical role of wetlands to people and to the planet. And so World Wetlands Day is celebrated every year on the 2nd of February since 1997. And it's done in recognition of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, which was signed in 1971 as an international binding treaty. So each year, the theme of World Wetlands Day, a different theme is selected. And so this year it is wetlands and human well-being. And so this theme really recognizes how interconnected wetlands and human life are, with people drawing sustenance, inspiration, and resilience from these productive ecosystems. So about 6% of the Earth's land surface is covered by wetlands, and of these 6%, a quarter is located in Canada. So our country, therefore, has a special responsibility to protect this important natural capital, not just for Canadians, but for people all over the world. Now, sadly, 35% of the world's wetlands have been lost since 1970, and 85% if we go back to the early 1700s. And because of this, of course, wetland plants, species, and animals are at the risk of extinction, while also threatening human well-being, livelihoods, food security, and the health of the planet. So it's urgent that we continue to raise national and global awareness about wetlands to reverse their rapid loss and encourage actions to conserve and restore them. And World Wetlands Day is the ideal time to increase people's appreciation for these critically important ecosystems. So since 2013, the Ecohydrology Research Group at the University of Waterloo has been organizing a research symposium to celebrate World Wetlands Day. So this year I would also like to thank the Waterloo Wetland Laboratory led by Dr. Rebecca Rooney and the Wetland Soils and Greenhouse Gas Exchange Lab led by Maria Strack for your help in making this happen. On today's World Wetlands Day celebration, we also have a special announcement. Namely that our urban wetland research sites have recently been selected to become part of UNESCO's global network of ecohydrology demonstration sites. So this network is coordinated by the UNESCO Ecohydrology Program, which, as it states here, aims to advance the integration of social, ecological, and hydrological research and to generate outcomes that enable the development of effective policies and practices for integrated water resources management. So the Urban Ecohydrology Observatory comprises a series of blue-green stormwater infrastructure, including urban wetlands, in southern Ontario. They're concentrated in the Waterloo region and in the Greater Toronto area. And so the overall objective of our observatory is to provide science-based guidance to optimize the co-benefits of urban blue-green infrastructure for water quality protection, climate mitigation, biodiversity, and the provision of many other ecosystems. And now, before I introduce our distinguished lecturer, if she comes back, it's my pleasure to announce the Poster Competition Awards. So, in our undergraduate category, the winner is Jordan Takar. And so in the graduate category, the winner is Emma Wegner. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce the distinguished lecturer for this year, Dr. Andrea Kirkwood. She will be talking about the value of urban wetlands. So Dr. Kirkwood completed a joint honors degree in environment and resources studies and biology in the co-op program here at the University of Waterloo. She then went on to obtain a master's degree in aquatic ecology at McMaster University and then a doctoral degree in environmental microbiology at the University of Toronto. Andrea conducted postdoctoral studies at Oklahoma State University and the University of Calgary prior to joining the Faculty of Science at Ontario Tech University. Andrea currently holds a Research Excellence Chair in Urban Water and is a professor in the Department of Biological Science. In addition to research and teaching, Andrea is actively involved in community-based environmental stewardship initiatives. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. I've been talking a lot for the last couple of days, and of course, right at the penultimate moment, I start, having a cough, and I didn't have my water with me. So hopefully my voice won't disappear through my talk, but I'm really excited to be here. As Philippe mentioned, this is my alma mater, and I've met so many amazing students and technicians and faculty over the last few days. I'm just so thrilled to be here. So before I begin, bonjour. I live and work on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. These lands are covered under the Williams Treaties, and I'm thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. I am also grateful to be delivering my presentation on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I acknowledge these lands out of respect for the Indigenous nations who have cared for Turtle Island from before the arrival of settler peoples until this day. Most importantly, I remember that the history of these lands has been tainted by poor treatment and a lack of friendship with the Indigenous peoples who call them home. And so words are important, but actions bring change, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has produced a calls to action report to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. So just a small part of my ongoing work towards reconciliation, I am learning about Anishinaabe language and culture from Anishinaabe knowledge keepers where I work and live. Okay, so I'm not sure, you can't really see it because the light's on, but if you can imagine, there's a picture there of a very lush island with coastal wetlands, which I'll use my little pointer here. Better. Now, this is obviously an artist's rendering of what a very famous place used to look like before first contact with Europeans in North America. Does anyone want to guess where this is located? Yes. So it's the island of Mannahatta, and this is part of the Mannahatta Project, where I believe it's the Wildlife Conservation Society had a project. This is from several years ago now, but they wanted to use various layers of data and information to reconstruct what the island looked like before European settlers. And as you can see, there's quite a glaring difference. With urbanization, this is kind of an extreme example, but of course it's very common, especially in coastal areas around the world, where coastal wetlands were just filled in. In fact, they extended the land beyond the original shoreline. So what about Ontario? So kind of zooming into all of us who are living in Ontario and studying wetlands. Well, there was a great paper that was not too old, actually. It's just from a few years ago by Penfound and Vaz that looked at total wetland loss in southern Ontario over the last 200 years. And so if you can see the black demarcations here, wherever you see a lot of black, those are wetlands. And of course, you see right down here by Lake St. Clair, this whole entire area was one contiguous wetland. And so what they found is that when they kind of bifurcated their study from 1800 to 1978, and then 1978 to, I believe, 2019, you can see that when you see blue and green, that all represents wetland loss. And it's just the time period. So of course, in the 1800s, the blue here just shows where a lot of land was converted for agriculture. And then you start to get a bit more of a diversification in land use between 1978 and present day. And so if we would just kind of drill down into what kind of land use, they actually looked at the built-up areas, rail lines, roads, compared to tile drainage areas. And of course, tile drainage wipes everything else off the map, so to speak. And so you can see here in the last 30-odd years, tile drainage has pretty much caused most of the wetland loss in southwestern Ontario. But I want to draw your attention to this kind of burgundy reddish color bar, which is municipality built-up area. So urbanization, it's starting to creep up. So by no means is it the biggest cause of wetland loss, or presently or in the past, but it is on an increasing trajectory. And I think for all of us who live in Ontario, recognize that there's a lot of development pressure for housing. Very much, the government that we have right now wants to kind of perpetuate this suburban model of the 1950s. And so that is just really looking for kind of untouched land, agricultural lands to convert for urbanization. So I'm trying to set the stage for why we should care about urban wetlands. But if a lot of the wetlands have already been lost, so some estimates go as low as 70% to up to 90% in southern Ontario, especially in urban areas. Most of us weren't even born when these wetlands were long gone. So why should we even care? Out of sight, out of mind. But we do have remaining wetlands. And of course, if you kind of look at it from that perspective, with whatever we have left, we should really value and try and protect, just because they're becoming increasingly rare. And so, I basically loaded this question by showing pretty pictures of wildlife and people walking along a boardwalk. And of course, that's when we think about wetlands, it's really the beauty of nature and the kind of the human value of wetlands. But of course, all wetlands, even those in urban environments, have ecological value, and they also have human value. And you're probably looking at those pictures and you're wondering, like, am I supposed to find, when you compare pictures, like, what's the difference? There is no difference, because wetlands have ecological and human value that's inextricably linked, that you really can't have the human value without the ecological. And so what do I mean by that? So with ecological, and of course this is not an exhaustive list, But when we think about, ecological, like as ecologists studying these systems, of course we're interested in the biodiversity, just the different types of organisms, their interactions, and how kind of, the emergent properties of these interactions influence the processes that happen in wetlands. And, the main ones, and of course the ones that we're interested in my lab, is energy flow, so coming up from the primary producers up into the primary and secondary and tertiary consumers. Nutrient cycling, this can really involve any kind of element that we consider a nutrient, but of course a lot of attention is placed on nitrogen and phosphorus for plants, and hydrological dynamics. So wetlands are really interesting systems, and of course I'm using this umbrella term of wetlands, but there's so many different types of wetlands that the hydrological dynamics actually can dictate the type of wetland that you're working with. And so all of these aspects of the kind of ecological integrity of a wetland feeds the ecosystem services that we rely on. And so when we think of biodiversity, the human-centric lens is really its biophilia. And this is maybe a term ecologists probably know. If you're a conservation biologist, E.O. Wilson probably coined this term in the 70s. Basically translated, people that love life. And so all the biodiversity on the planet. And it's basically this intrinsic value of biodiversity. Biodiversity from an ecological perspective is what we know that biological communities function really well when they have higher biodiversity. Now, ecosystem processes can translate into function with respect to energy flow. Well, that's a form of carbon sequestration that we're interested in that value. Nutrient retention, for example, with phosphorus, and finally with flood control. And in fact, that's where a lot of probably the focus is on wetlands, is their value in flood control. And so as I was preparing this talk, and I know there's a certain person, and I think Nandita's in the audience. Well, her lab did a really, it's like, hey, this is exactly what I'm looking for, a meta-analysis on, I mentioned nutrient retention, and that's just one kind of important ecosystem service. And so in order to kind of quantify that, it's these meta-analyses that really just take all the data and information that's available and to analyze it to really get a sense of what's the fate of phosphorus in these systems. And I love this drawing, or I guess I should say it's more of a, it's probably done on a computer, but graphic. But if you look at the white and the black arrows, it just really does a really nice job. You have water inflowing that carries phosphorus, both particulate and dissolved phosphorus. And there's lots happening. And this is, wetlands are like bioreactors. There's physical processes that are, causing sedimentation, but then microbial and plant activities that are really dictating the fate of phosphorus. And this is focusing on phosphorus, but of course nitrogen is another important element that we're interested in as a nutrient. And so overall, I was really quite fascinated and actually quite happy to see that, and of course, over time, wetlands can be sources and sinks, depending on changing, seasons and conditions. But apparently, most of them, when it comes to both particulate phosphorus and phosphate, which is the bioavailable form of phosphorus, wetlands are a net sink. And so when we talk about ecosystem services of wetlands, we're starting to get more and more science to basically say that they have this value of nutrient retention. And so then I was looking for economic valuation, because sometimes that's what resonates with people is dollar signs, right? And then, of course, in the Van Kapelin lab, they actually looked at this. And you can see that, again, focusing on Southern Ontario, where that's the most pressure on wetland loss. And they looked at the different wetland types, so bogs, fens, marshes, and swamps. And overall, and of course with a relatively wide margin of error here, but really still within the ballpark of billions of dollars per year of sediment retention and phosphorus retention. And of course, swamps, which are very abundant on the landscape, accounted for about 80% of it. So there are some now kind of quantitative numbers that we can use to show the ecosystem service value of wetlands. Even though we've lost so many of them, the ones that we still have a very important value. Okay, so now kind of zooming into urban wetlands. And really I'm asking the question, well, do urban wetlands have value? If hopefully you can see, like this picture here, you probably think that's just like a pond with pond scum, like algae. But in fact, it's duckweed. And it's one of our coastal wetlands that we study, Carruthers Marsh, which I'll show some data for. But just the one summer, this just became a blanket of duckweed in the marsh. And if you know anything about duckweed, it creates anoxic conditions below the suspended roots, and which is great for plants because it's basically creating an environment where they can have internal loading of nutrients. But it's very unsightly. And in fact, I was talking with some folks today about these constructed wetlands of the part of the Don River mouth restoration and naturalization project, and just how when people see like the filamentous green algae starting to grow in these new wetlands, they're kind of upset about it. So you have wetlands that, like this doesn't even look like a wetland, but shortly I'll talk about it's actually a pretty famous fragment of a wetland that had a lot of news attention a few years ago. And then here's another kind of swamp wetland in Ajax where you see a shopping cart, and it's kind of unsightly, some dead trees. So the public probably look at this and don't really see any value in urban wetlands. And so I want to talk about that a little bit more to try and convince you that there actually are, they do have value, even if some of them don't look very nice. Okay, so if you're not aware, if you live in Canada, most of us live in cities. So over 82% of people in Canada live in cities. And this is a GIF I made on Google Earth Engine a couple of years ago. But it starts in the late 80s, and it makes its way all to, I think, 2020, if I remember correctly. Here are the coastal wetlands I'm going to be talking about shortly. So there's Frenchman's Bay, so this is Pickering, Ajax, and there's the Green Belt in Ajax, and Whitby. And you'll see the 407 popping up there. So it does a pretty good job. Don't worry so much about the pink and the gray. It's all development, but just showing that as you move north, in my neck of the woods, that's where the development pressure is. And I had to, because I'm in Waterloo, of course, I found that Stats Canada has reported that Waterloo region is one of the fastest growing areas. So I live in an area, you're currently in an area that is really facing a lot of urbanization pressure. So how does urbanization affect wetlands? Well, I would say all surface waters are affected by just that change from whether it's agricultural or natural lands into an urban environment, which is dominated by impervious surfaces. So buildings, roads, rooftops, parking lots, they basically are changing the way water can penetrate the soil. In most cases, it's forcing water over land, picking up even more dirt and contaminants, creating more energy, and so you end up having decreased infiltration, increased flows, which cause increased erosion as it makes its way into local tributaries, and of course increased contaminants because all of that water and the force of that water is able to pick up more contaminants. And I include nutrients in this as well. But also urbanization, just the sheer building of new roads and shopping malls and subdivisions starts to fragment and infill little wet patches. And I think this is it's really been happening over the last 30 years. And I think in Rebecca Rooney, in collaboration with Waverly Birch, did a study that is showing that more and more kind of within urban boundaries, remnant wetlands are being converted to stormwater management ponds. And that's a talk for a whole other day. But at the end of the day, urban wetlands are dealing with a lot of stress. And they are, generally speaking, especially if you just focus on the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, are impaired with respect to their ecological integrity, and as I've already told you, that's interlinked with their ecosystem services, presumably. So now that I've told you that they're so impacted, are they beyond repair? And I know developers like to sell that story, but I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to show you some data today that shows that actually, yeah, are they pristine, highly functioning systems? That remains to be further studied, but they absolutely still do have important ecological function. And of course, this is my segue into answering that question, why should we care about urban wetlands? Well, local citizens actually care about them. So if you see in the background of this photo, it looks like a farmer's field, and in fact, there is a lot of farming that happens on part of the Duffins Creek wetland complex. It used to be a provincially significant wetland, but we think of the coastal wetland, which is right down by the lake, but it's part of a much more interconnected through groundwater and surface water flow of a wetland complex that actually has a variety of different wetland types. That's more of a kind of a wet meadow that's in the background. And so people really stepped up, like grassroots, because of, and I won't go too much into detail, especially for those people who are not from Ontario, but we have a current government that is just creating legislation to bypass the normal procedure for environmental assessments. And so ministerial zoning orders basically was given to a developer that wanted to put a warehouse on this part of a provincially significant wetland. And I think for the public, they heard provincially significant and they said, what? I don't understand what it means, but that sounds important. And so part of this process was Rebecca Rooney and Nandita Basu and myself, when this was happening, we were really concerned that is this going to be, for all the very few wetlands we have left in urban areas, we have to kind of get the message out that they're actually still very important, even if they don't look very nice. And I'm the first to admit, they're full of phragmites and garbage, but this is part of a wetland complex that should remain connected. And then more recently, and this is Crothers Marsh, which I'm going to be including in some of my data slides, it's part of a very narrow watershed that is not part of the green belt, unfortunately, and there's a lot of pressure in the headwaters to develop. So all this to say is that the Duffins Creek Marsh, Crothers Marsh, facing increasing pressure, and really Amazon stepped in to say when it saw the bad press about the warehouse, they pulled out, and that basically left the developer without a customer or client. And so it's sad to say, but it basically Amazon saved Duffins Creek Marsh for at least for the time being. Okay, so urban wetlands. I think there's a lot of interest now in trying to show, well, what kinds of services, what kind of ecological function do they have? And I would argue that they do have, they offer a lot by means of water quality improvement, wildlife habitat, and so forth. But what's not included in this, this was the government of Ontario from a few years ago, had really just a nice infographic of the ecosystem services of wetlands. But also that what we've talked about with phosphorus retention, for example, this physical clarification of the suspended sediments, infiltration, as well as the biogeochemical purification, whether it's through physical means or through biodegradation. And I'm a biologist, so the very first graduate student in my lab, his study was on urban wetlands in our area. And so this is kind of, I have two bookends. I have my first graduate student, and then the second study I'm going to talk about is a very recent study with a recent graduate student in my lab. So the question that we wanted to ask, and it was just a nice little study that was fairly local, but I was really interested in knowing how these ecosystems function with respect to basically biodegrading contaminants as well as retaining nutrients as well, but coming from a microbiology type of interest and focus. And so really the question was, or at least the objective was, to assess the capacity of urban wetlands from different urbanization histories to tolerate and biodegrade contaminants. And so We only had one of each type, but we tried to sample it fairly intensively in different seasons. And so a remnant wetland here, which is basically just in the headwaters of Pringle Creek. It's just surrounded by subdivisions. And a historically contaminated remnant wetland. And so in the background, you'll see there's a capped landfill. So since the 1950s, this is in Oshawa, GM would just dump all of their waste, hazardous waste, and metal, and pretty much you name it, it got dumped in this landfill. And so for many decades, the landfill leached into this wetland. And so historically, it's had a lot of heavy metal contamination, but some other things like paint thinner, and we kind of heard that it was just a mixed bag. And so we just wanted to know, and in fact, there was a toxicologist, Doug Holdway, in his lab. He was interested in if it's still impacting the local creek. And then finally, a mature constructed wetland. And full disclosure, this is a stormwater pond 1.0, so it has no forebay, and it wasn't really managed. It was almost like it was the first attempt of this. I think it's a 30-year-old subdivision where they tried to divert, and it's still kind of connected to the creek system. So it's a very old system. Since the study was done, basically a decade ago now, they've dredged it and they've rebuilt it. So now it complies with more modern day standards for stormwater management. But at the time, it really was very much a wetland. And so when Nick went out, he took lots of cores of sediments, and he ran a number of different bioassays to get a sense of the microbial capacity for contaminant removal, but also resilience as well. And so one of the first things that he looked at was just the physical structure, and then just like pH and salinity and moisture. And whether it was the remnant wetland, the contaminated remnant wetland, or the constructed wetland, they're all pretty much the same, even in their soil characterization. Like, they had very similar sand, silt, and clay and soil type. But the one thing that they differed in, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who studies stormwater management ponds here, is that the constructed wetland, which is receiving runoff directly from the roads, had the highest salinity at that time. Then when he wanted to look at the effect of copper sulfate, just basically a toxicant, to look at how sensitive the microbial community was. Not surprisingly, the constructed wetland was the most sensitive. And I say that because typically copper sulfate is used as an algicide, and this is much more kind of aquatic wetland compared to the other ones. But the contaminated remnant wetland, which has this history of being exposed to heavy metals, interestingly was really tolerant to copper sulfate. So we're getting kind of a picture of resilience that's emerging from this. And of course, urbanization is a major source of metals as well, just from brake pads and any industrial activities. So at the time, maybe some of you worked, there's still kind of neat little assays to do physiological fingerprinting. These are known as community-level physiological profiles, or ecoplates. And so there's about 32 different substrates that microbes can use. And you get this kind of neat-looking fingerprint that you can then look at the similarities across the different sites. So this is basically representing, so the numbers represent seasons, so going spring, summer, fall, so 1, 2, 3. And then lots of intra-wetland spatial variation. So he had distinct sites along a transect. And so what we found overall is that the contaminated remnant wetland and the remnant wetland very similar. So they just kind of intermingled with their profiles, but the constructed wetland was very distinct. So its microbial community liked a very kind of unique different types of carbon substrates. And now this isn't used very much anymore, DGGE, but again, it's a DNA fingerprinting approach where targeting the 16S ribosomal RNA gene, which is a highly conserved region. It's great for studying diversity of bacteria. And we have less replicates here, but he definitely still has the seasonality. I think he lost one season. But the number of bands in a gel of a DGGE more or less represents, it's at the genus to species level of bacteria. And so, not a lot, huge amount. I wouldn't even go to the point of using the bands as a real assessment of diversity, but it's still relative. And so we found that the remnant wetland it was still kind of the most diverse, but the contaminated remnant wetland was actually more unique based on its 16S. So this is actually quite interesting because the physiology and the phylogeny are not mapping together. And that's actually not that surprising. Now finally, and this is where we collaborated with my former PhD supervisor, Roberta Fulthorpe. She had a radioisotope lab where we did C14 biodegradation experiments. And basically over 21 days, we didn't want to run it too long because we still kind of wanted it to be within the environmentally realistic time frame for mobile organic compounds like 2,4-D, which is a herbicide, to kind of be in the system and leave the system. And interestingly enough, out of the 3 different wetland types, the remnant wetland had the greatest capacity for biodegradation. So full mineralization of 2,4-D, which is a fairly complex chlorinated organic compound. And so the key findings was that the wetlands really didn't have, their physiology and phylogeny weren't, and I should probably preface this with saying is that one of the questions was, does urbanization homogenize wetlands? Even though these were they had distinct histories, but at the end of the day, does that even matter? When they become urbanized and impacted by urbanization, do they all look the same? And we found no, they don't. And in fact, the remnant wetland, which is basically a fragment of a much larger one that used to exist, still it had a capacity for biodegradation. There's various reasons for this. We think that it's co-metabolism, so there's probably other substrates that are helping with the breakdown of these xenobiotic compounds. But it's just more or less saying that there might be some intrinsic biodiversity that's maintained in the remnant wetland that actually benefits, as an ecosystem service, can help remove this contaminant from the environment. Okay, so moving on to, that was an inland, little wetlands in Oshawa and Whitby, to coastal wetlands in the Great Lakes. And so we focus on Lake Ontario because that's just down the road from us. And so if you just follow my little pointer here, this is Rouge Marsh. This is part of the National Urban Park, the east end of Toronto. This is Frenchman's Bay. And so you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, isn't that a bay? But technically it's a barrier beach wetland, but it does have a permanent boat access inlet there. Duffins Creek Marsh. So remember I was talking about the wetland complex where there was that parcel, that kind of wet meadow that was going to be built on. That's up here, but here's the coastal wetland down here. And then over here, you can see how tiny, it's relatively small, Crothers Marsh. Okay, so this is just showing you, so the TRCA, Toronto Region Conservation Authority, they ran, and these are kind of rare, a very comprehensive water quality monitoring program that included nutrients and E. coli throughout the wetlands. So in the kind of more open water ones, so these 3 are drowned river mouth wetlands. This is a Barry Beach lagoon wetland. So it's more or less sampling sites where like a transect through the wetland. But these 2 wetlands, even though they're drowned river mouth, they're celled wetlands. So cells are basically ponds that naturally form in these types of wetlands, and they could be connected and disconnected at various times from the main channel. Because of course, these wetlands are fed by rivers that flow into them. So Duffins Creek, Crothers Creek, and Rouge River, and then even in Rouge River is here, and then even Petticoat Creek's going into Frenchman's Bay. But so not only did they do a transect from tributary input into the confluence with the lake, they actually sampled the cells as well. Okay, so I just wanted to give you that context because now I'm going to be talking about principal component biplots, which sometimes people see in there, and there is a lot of information. So I'm going to walk you through it. For those of you who love these you can just kind of ignore me and just focus on what you see. But basically, this is taking, a decade's worth of data, and you have the sites that are colored, and I'll just walk you through it. So CM1 is the closest to the lake, and CM3 would be the closest to the tributary confluence of the wetland, and more sites for Frenchman's Bay, but again, this site's the closest to the tributary confluence, and the number 1 is actually the closest to the lake. And so even though this is a different kind of wetland, this is that Barrier Beach Lagoon, this is a drowned river mouth, but it's just like one open basin. They kind of behave the same way. Generally speaking, you see a gradient of high concentrations of nutrients and other contaminants near the tributary confluence, and basically declining, especially nitrogen, declining by the time you get to the outflow at the lake. But what's interesting with this is that Tyler, so Tyler Harrow-Lyle, who's formerly a PhD student, he did a little MITEX project with TRCA for this one. But he just knows that phosphorus just wasn't really co-varying with what you'd expect, because we know the source is coming from the tributary, but it was it was just kind of, in each wetland, it just kind of, its vector just kind of went in a different direction. And so that made us start thinking more about internal loading and other factors. But land use really didn't come out as an important variable. You know why? Because if you recall from that last slide I showed, I'll go back. See all that gray? That's all urban development. So we're really great in the GTA. Instead of leaving our waterfront to be beautiful and lush and green, we industrialize it. And so, and that hasn't changed in 30 years. So that really didn't come out as being an important factor. But we're starting to see water level and various parameters that we're using from a buoy that was out in Lake Ontario, that DFO was collecting data about onshore currents and alongshore currents and wind speeds. And we were getting a bit of a picture that, the lake may be involved in these patterns we're seeing. Now, these are the celled wetlands. Okay, you can see the cells there. Some of them are filled with plants, emergent plants. And in fact, Corner Marsh here, it's hard to see it, but it's been restored. It underwent about 10 to 12 years ago, and it's full of emergent plants. And what we found is that when you compare the celled sites with the non-celled sites within the wetlands, so Duffins and Rouge, they had significantly different water quality profile, so using an analysis called Permanova, and basically found that they had elevated levels of phosphorus and phosphate, even organic nitrogen. And so overall, from these PCA biplots, nitrogen seemed to be decreasing across all the wetlands. But phosphorus just had a weird kind of pattern to it that we wanted to delve into a bit more to understand what was going on, especially with these celled wetlands, because they seem to be a source, but at the same time, those wetlands seem to be performing the best when it comes to being net sinks. So I've added these blue lines here to show you that's the zero line. So the dots above represent there being kind of a net, a net source. So meaning that phosphorus is leaving the wetland into the near shore of Lake Ontario versus being a net sink. And this is from 2009 to 2019. That's the range of the data. And so we just focused on the drowned river marshes for this particular analysis. And you can see that Carruthers Marsh, just that open basin, overall, depending on the year, tends to be more of a source of phosphorus, whereas Duffins and Rouge, they vary over time. But generally speaking, if you were to maybe average them, they tend to be sinks for a significant number of years. And so we wanted to understand, what is it about the celled marshes? Again, very small sample size of the different marsh types, but when you have a very long and intensively sampled data set, sometimes you're able to do some fun statistics with the data. And so just to kind of lead into this model I'm going to show you, I just want to, not everyone knows what a seiche is. A seiche is basically a standing wave. And so in the Great Lakes, we have seiches that are really driven by prevailing winds. And so you could go, like Lake Erie is the most famous one for seiches because the change in water level from one side of the lake to the other can be quite dramatic. But it's not just one way. It's like basically a pendulum. If you think, you know, with water swishing back and forth, that's exactly what they are. And so you don't necessarily get a seiche with just one direction, one wind direction. So